I'm a PhD candidate in informatics and a film shopper. And today I'm very excited to be moderating Ariana's talk. So I will give a brief introduction to her. So Ariana Gunderson is a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University. She holds a master's in gastronomy from the Center of Food Studies at Boston University and a BA in psychology from Brown University. Ariana studies the German recipe industry and food media, researching how food experiences are contextualized, valued, and sold. In recent months, she has been exploring film photography as part of her fieldwork. And today she's presenting a very exciting piece called Authorship and Originality in the Food Knowledge Commons. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to share with you today a newer project that is it's really born out of my time here at the Ostrom Workshop. I have to let them in. Oh, no, I just kicked them out.
David should be doing it.
Okay. Welcome. This project was really born in the Ostrom Workshop. I applied to Ostrom with a project on land enclosure from restaurants in San Francisco. But as I was taking Dan's course last semester and thinking about my dissertation research on recipes, I realized more and more that an Ostromian lens would really enrich the research that I was thinking of doing next. So I'm very grateful I was able to pivot to my recipe research, thinking about self-governance and property, and I'm drawing on a lot of new threads, including things that I'm learning in an intellectual property law class I'm taking this semester. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and advice for next steps. So a question that I have is, how do you get someone to pay for common knowledge? So in the knowledge commons, we think about ideas as being out there for everyone, but they sometimes get privatized into individual impressions that can be thought of as private property. So how do you get someone to pay for something that is shared out there? One way to do it is to make it appear to be uncommon. And this is the strategy of cookbook publishers. So they pull this off every day. They convince people to purchase cookbooks that have food knowledge, even though food knowledge is in the mind and body of every person. It's maximally diffuse, it's unevenly distributed, but people share food knowledge for free all the time. When they tell someone how to make something, when you watch someone make a dish, when you try something new for the first time. And so I'm interested in how cookbook publishers pull this off. And I have three hypotheses that I want to sort of trace in my research. And I think some ways that publishers accomplish this is by claiming authorship, controlling circulation, and appealing to taste. So thinking about authorship claims, it's really important, as we see on all these, the role of the author is really important. And so having that claim to originality, that claim to authorship, and that creation makes it seem unique. It makes it seem uncommon. It also helps to control circulation through intellectual property law, that in order for something to be copyrighted, it has to have a really clear author. And so then when something's protected by IP, the owner can control the circulation so that it only circulates under contexts that are considered profitable or advantageous to the IP owner. Finally, cookbook publishers appeal to taste in ways like having really beautiful photographs on every page. Those are really expensive to print, but they're highly coveted by people who are purchasing cookbooks. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about the first two. I'm looking forward to going on photo shoots in Germany this summer with recipe developers. So that's more of a future direction. But today I'm going to talk about the first ideas I have in terms of claiming authorship and controlling circulation. So I want to return to the importance of the role of the author and authorial ascription in cookbooks. So in all of these, and in probably most cookbooks that are sold today, the most popular ones, the role of the author is really important. Their name or their image, their brand is associated with it. And so what is authorship and what's its relationship to originality in cookbooks? Is authorship an achievement, a result of past work? Is it a brand? Is it the result of a unique genius of someone creating original material? That's the image that you would understand if you just go on, you think, oh, Mark Bittman knows how to cook everything. But Mark Bittman didn't create all of that. And the recipe developers that I spoke to have a really different idea from this image that's portrayed in the publishing world of single authorship. So Ellie, a recipe developer I spoke to in Hamburg, said, I get so much inspiration from others. And I believe that's just what happens when you write recipes. And that's a good and beautiful thing. That allows it to develop further, because seeing other people's recipes is the only way it's possible to develop further. So she sees the recipes that she writes as part of a long chain of communication and innovation, a braid of recipes from the past and also stretching into the future as she sees this like future development and evolution. And so that's really in contrast to the idea of Mark Bittman telling you how to cook everything all on his own. Another recipe developer I spoke to, Andra, said that she thinks about it not as like new creation, but as a twist, as some sort of fresh hook. Du suchst eigentlich immer nach dem neuen Dreh. You're just always searching for that new twist. And so I asked her for an example of what some kind of new twist might be. I start by gathering a lot of old cookbooks, many old magazines, and Pinterest to get ideas. When I see something, I think, okay, I can take a piece from that. Let's say, for example, streusel, a crumble is really easy. How could I change the crumble? Could I make it sugar-free? Should I add pretzel sticks? I think about how I can make it something new that I haven't seen before, and I combine like that. So obviously newness is important. It's part of the hook for the market to get someone to buy something. It makes something appealing and innovative, but she's not starting from zero. She's taking lots of print recipes and digital recipes as well, and then thinking what she can take away, like sugar, or what she can add, like pretzel sticks, to make it something new. And the recipe developers I spoke to framed their creation as something of combining and mixing over and over, which really reminds me of Roland Barthes' idea of the death of the author, that a text is a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. So Barthes has a very like violent, feverish idea of the way that textual production is all thrown together. But similarly, he describes it as a tissue of quotations that are drawn from all these other places. And that, he says, is the death of the author. The author God is the single font. But even if you did think that you came up with a recipe that was totally original, like you thought you didn't consciously remember taking it from anywhere else, and you just think it's really never before been done, and you can't find a recipe for it anywhere, it still can't be truly new. Ellie said to me, even if there weren't a cookbook anywhere that I could look in, there's a very high probability that someone had cooked something like that. Maybe it's not written anywhere, and maybe I can't find the recipe, but it's definitely existed before. And so this makes me think about the difference between food knowledge out there and the like particular textual impressions of recipes as artifacts. And so I found the ideas, artifacts, and facilities breakdown from Understanding Knowledge as a Commons, written by Charlotte Hess and Eleanor Ostrom, to be interesting here. So when thinking about knowledge, these sort of like three tiers in the knowledge commons, the ideas are the intangible content, the mental images, the creative vision. So that's like the idea of chicken soup. And then the artifacts are recipes. They're textual impressions, specific expressions of how to make something in one particular time. Facilities are not really the focus, but they're where the artifacts are stored. So like cookbooks or libraries. But I wonder, when Ellie draws this distinction between recipes and food, I wonder where food fits. Like I think it's an artifact because it's a particular expression of something being cooked, but it doesn't have the same durability as a text. And so it feels in some ways more ephemeral and intangible like ideas, but it is definitely a material expression. So that's something I'm still thinking through. And if you have any thoughts about that, I'd love to hear them. So obviously, claims of authorship and originality that we see in intellectual property law and the covers of cookbooks don't really match up with what the recipe developers themselves describe as their process. So why is it that cookbooks then have this really strong claim to individual authorship? And I think it's because of the publishing industry's investment in intellectual property. So as I said, I'm in an intellectual property law class this semester. So it's American law, and I'm at the very beginning. So one of my goals for this summer is to learn more about German intellectual property law. But in IP, to qualify for copyright protection, a work must be original to the author. So this is a really strong link between originality and authorship. And originality here means that it's independently created by the author, so that they did it not necessarily alone, but on their own and not drawing on someone else's intellectual property, and that it possesses some minimal degree of creativity. So what's interesting is when I've studied the process of writing recipes, it's a very creative process. It's iterative. There's a lot of time in the kitchen that's spent making a lot of difficult creative decisions. But a recipe itself is not considered copyrightable because it's not considered to meet that minimum degree of creativity. The way that I've heard it explained is that there's only so many ways that you could give the instructions for how to make muffins. And so it's not creative enough. But notably, the literary headnotes and the photographs that surround a recipe are copyrightable because they are recognized as being more creative. So when you introduce a recipe by saying where you learned it or what it makes you think of or who you dedicated it to, or when there's photographs depicting that dish in a particular way, those are protected under copyright. So the book as a whole is. And so I think that the recipes which are not considered IP are being embedded in this dense frame of intellectual property by publishers. And so that there could be a claim of authorship and originality, and that gives control over circulation. And so that's the process through which a recipe which is not considered protectable ends up de facto being protected and under the circulation control of the publisher. So I must be nervous because I talked much faster than I had in my practice. So I'm sorry if I sped through. But I'm really interested in hearing from you about advice for new directions. My summer plans are very open. And so I'm excited to see what I should search for in the field this summer. And I'm also interested in getting some help thinking through authorship as a kind of ownership. So something that I thought through in the paper that I wrote for Dan's class was about the bundle of rights that the bundle of rights that the Ostroms consider as a frame to think about property rights. And I'm trying to figure out where authorship fits here. So IP protected authorship, I can sort of see that that's a more straightforward property claim. But what about the authorship for the recipes that are not protected under copyright? I wonder, where do they fit into this bundle of rights? So I'm curious if anyone has any ideas or questions about that. And also, I'd love to hear what you think about the idea of turning common knowledge into private property in the context of something that's as diffuse as food knowledge and that isn't produced in a highly consolidated arena. So thank you so much. I want to give a little plug for an Ostrom supported event. On April 21st, we're going to have an all-day symposium on recipe theft. So we'll have a historian, an anthropologist, and a recipe developer coming into Bloomington to talk about recipe theft in India, Morocco, and Puerto Rico, and Germany. So mark your calendars and hope to see you there. We'll have a recipe development workshop if you want to see how the sausage gets made. And thank you to the Austin Workshop for all of your support.
Will there be catering at this event is my first question. Some of these recipes. Good, all right.
Okay, so I'm not an intellectual property expert by any means, but IP is not, especially in copyright, is not known for its intellectual or logical consistency.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing you might do is analogize to things that are similar to recipes but are treated differently. So for example, most 90+% of any new jazz tune you hear is a so-called contrafact, which is to say it is based on a previous composition by somebody else, and sometimes they're barely disguised, and yet they're copyrightable. It seems to me that the amount of creativity involved there is not much greater than with a recipe. And of course, there are only so many combinations of melodies, chord progressions, rhythms, dynamics, and so forth that you can have in a song. So, is it the case that we're too protective? We create too much property in songs or in mystery novels that are also often very much written to pattern. Food recipes have the same problem as dress designs historically have had, which are also not copyrightable. And so what is or is not subject of copyright protection seems to me sort of not random, but what industries can get Congress's attention and haven't carry enough weight to get Congress to include them in copyright law.
Thank you for that. And something we've discussed before that I'm really struck by in the examples you raise is the association of femininity with dress designs and recipes. That's not the case in jazz music. And so I wonder, that would be an interesting to come down.
Okay, so it's will be, I think, sending you into kind of a path to take this project kind of upside down, probably, but I think it would be interesting. So let me maybe a comment about how I understand intellectual property rights from an economic point of view. So if I have the intellectual or copyright or patent over the recipe to produce this iPhone, that means that I can block anybody else from using that recipe and produce that iPhone. So I have the monopoly over that idea for the period that the patent or the copyright is valid, okay? So publishing a book with recipes, so it's widely available and people can use those recipes, exactly the opposite of intellectual property right in some sense. Because what you are doing is like, okay, so intellectual property right would be, if a restaurant is trying to use a recipe and I own the recipe, I will be blocking that restaurant. When I will go into a home to a person, or you want to use this recipe to produce this pie, you cannot because I have an intellectual property right. But since this is not allowed, so you cannot have a copyright over a recipe, so essentially there is no intellectual property right, then you can use it the way you want, okay? And then I don't see how publishing a book that summarizes recipes affect in any way other strategies. So if you want to get your recipe through other channels, the publisher of the book cannot block you in any way. So essentially, this is the opposite. So in some sense, what this is good about this project and the part that I love about this project is that it show a case in which there is a lot of innovation without intellectual property rights. And that's the beauty of this case. A lot of innovation in cooking, a lot of fusion of different types of cuisines. Everything happened with no intellectual property rights. So from the econ perspective, I would encourage you to read David Levine's Michele Boldrin Against Intellectual Monopoly. It's a book from, or it has 10 or 15 years now. They're essentially pushing for, let's do the same that you are observing in cooking, in many other sectors, in many other industries. We will get a kind of a better and higher innovation, okay? So essentially, it's like, turn the project kind of upside down as an example in which how good it is to get rid of intellectual property.
I think that's really interesting and I appreciate that. I think I'm also curious about because the recipe that's protected for the production of the iPhone is protected under patents or like trade secrets rather than copyright. And so I'm definitely interested to explore more how those have different strategies of controlling circulation. I think I agree with your point that this innovation and production happens without the IP protecting the recipe itself. And that's why when you go on like the blog world, there's all these recipes copied exactly from a cookbook. I think what I want to still sort of track down is like, and yet people still buy cookbooks. Cookbooks are a really strong part of the publishing industry. And so there's something about the cookbook beyond the recipe that people are all also buying it for, even if they could go find all those recipes online. So I think that's like another.
I would say, can I have a follow? So the convenience of having everything put in a framework, that, you know, everything in just one book.
Mm-hmm.
Again, so that's it. They're just paying for the convenience of that.
I think
Like a textbook, no? It's like,
I mean, I think that textbooks do something different than cookbooks. So a lot of the cookbook research that's been done is historical. So thinking about what cookbooks have done for people through time. And some of it is providing instruction how to cook, but a lot of it is giving a presentation of self and like taste. And so when someone comes to my home and they see that I have all these Yotomo Delaney books, that says something about me and it says something about me to myself. And so that presentation of taste and aesthetic desirability, that's a big part of it. I'm sure we all own a lot of cookbooks we've never cooked from, but they're still doing something for us by sitting there on the shelf. Thank you so much, Gustavo.
A lot of questions. Also, any of yours follow up from that? Or else I'll take.
Well, my kind of like builds on that. And so I'm like sort of makes me ask like how this work of recipes and cookbooks, you know, sort of is a parallel to fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, how those are not copyrightable. Fairy tales or folk stories or what have you. And so I don't know, that's where I see a parallel, because anybody can publish Grimm Brothers fairy tales in any book that they want to. I believe, I mean, I'm talking outside of my expertise, but that it seems like that is like a very close parallel, like that these would fit in the folklore genre of things. So I don't know if that field would shed light on this question.
I was trying to see the connection between both things. Like this is a problem when we enter to the cultural commons, because as you were talking, there are so many like knowledge that is shared by many people. One recipe is much easier to understand than the recipe to create an iPhone. Usually those recipes are more into one specific people. And probably in this case, the editorial field in music, as you were saying, could give you some ways to look for that, because we are talking about the same. Around the Renaissance, all of the music was free. We don't have authors before that. However, when the publishing companies started, when we started to find authors, and if we can to track down, that was because of an economic element. Now you have something that you can sell and you can say, I can win money because of that. And it shifted the full concept of intellectual property and cultural things. Probably that's something that can help that little bit.
I'm sorry that I missed your so wanted to get here, but it's like, I think I heard what's in it from these comments and that I can bring them all together. First of all, I spend a lot of time in the fashion business, so I like totally get what you're saying. I made very, very popular garments that were copied and copied and copied and copied. And, you know, I kept running into people saying, oh, I'm so glad you did that. I've made so much money on doing a copy of it. So this is, to me, a fascinating topic of, you know, how it goes to the recipe world and fairy tales. That's another thing. Like Disney actually stole as far as I'm concerned, stole the Grimm fairy tales, took them out of the public domain and locked them down. So now all kids think, you know, Snow White is the Snow White version that they see in Disney. So, and then plus, as you know, we do a lot of work in open source software. So I'm arguing on the Gustavo side of things, like it would be so interesting to see what happens, how you can get some version of ownership out of this without wrecking the commons that we bring all of these. And you make a really great point. Often it's women. Women were the storytellers, women were the cooks, women were the dressmakers. So it's that folk culture and where it aligns with commons thinking that I think this is like, recipes are like, that's the eye of the needle of figuring this problem out that relates to open source software even, you know. Anyway, I love the research.
As always, beautiful presentation. One thing that I was kind of struck was this idea of, you know, the classic like non-excludable and rivalrous notion. And it's kind of trying to grapple with that. Obviously, knowledge commons complicated in that regard. From your interviews, it almost sounded like the innovation of knowledge is almost the commons more than the actual presentation of the knowledge. Kind of building off that, it almost seems like there's like a separate commons between recipe developers and recipe users, which kind of goes back into this notion of like a pattern maker versus a dresswear. And I think that's maybe something to kind of parse down of like, are you only an appropriator when you're sharing a recipe, or are you an appropriator when you're doing the recipe? I think maybe pinning down exactly who that user is, I think would maybe be helpful pushing you forward. And then another thing to maybe look into is this notion. I was trying to think of things that are commons that are super fluid. I think fish and water, weirdly enough, maybe something if the knowledge commons are kind of feeling a little almost maybe too similar, maybe something interesting into just the notion of like, we all obviously benefit from sharing water. However, you know, someone needs to be making a profit in the current system we have. How does that kind of coincide with this notion? Also, just think it would be really cool to just look at the top recipe books in different countries and kind of consider. I think that may provide a framework of why people are buying recipe books. By that I mean cookbook.
Yeah. I was really struck by in Germany is that most of the top selling cookbooks were translated from English language markets. So there's very few cookbooks that were developed in Germany, and a lot of them were translated from the UK and then the US and then Australia. So I'm also interested in researching more about translation, and that's also interesting in like terms of derivative works in copyright law. And I think it speaks to the like globalization of the taste industry. And so it's also helping me to think about looking at my project, not as like just studying in Germany, but looking more at like a European or an international recipe market.
I almost wonder if it's more common that people aren't buying like American cookbooks anymore, in the sense of like American recipes anymore, if they're trying to expand. And I wonder if that's a similar notion in other countries as well.
Yeah. You mean like cookbooks that are painted as like nationalist?
Or just like how many people are actually going out and buying Betty Crocker versus how many people are buying a Ukrainian cookbook nowadays.
Couple of very splashy Ukrainian cookbooks this year. It's a way for people to show solidarity, I think. And Ree Drummond, Pioneer Woman, is extremely successful in the American market. So I think she's, edging out the Betty Crockers. I'm curious about your, sorry, can I make one more response? I'm curious about your idea of like the two separate commons for the recipe users and the like cookbook, the recipe developers and the cookbook purchasers. And I wonder if it's just like it's the same like body of knowledge, but it's two different approaches that and also for recipe developers, there is at some point where it becomes theft. Like there's some point where it's like you've gone too far. And it's described as like a code of honor to me. But one that, like she said, it was Ellie, she was like, there's a code of honor, but I mean, sometimes when you're really in a rush, you just, like the deadline's tight and, but I mean, but that's not a good thing to do. So,
Breaking down, I think property law is like the most distinct formal norm you're gonna see on there. I think breaking down those informal norms of like, when do you have to cite someone? When do you have to say this was inspired by someone? Versus when you can just be like, I read a recipe and then I added miso and now it's full new.
yeah. And it is very hard to know when you've copied from someone, because there are so many cookbooks that are, like in print somewhere, but not searchable online. And if you change 1/4 teaspoon, then so.
If it's somebody's grandma, you have to cite. That's the-
Yeah.
It's actually all the students go to, so. But just, maybe just really, is that right? Yeah. Maybe go first, and then we can.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to bring it back to, I really liked your setup and I like this research project a lot. And so the setup was kind of like talking about how do we turn this thing that's free into something that people would pay for, which is really compelling. But I think I might recommend modifying it a little bit. The idea that like free knowledge is not costless, and that's probably part of what plays into this. Like, I'm sure we've all used recipes online, like it's free, but it's not really free. There's this massive hassle factor with using recipes online, with probably collector data too, and all these ads. And it takes time and effort to go and get cooking information and recipe information from other kinds of free sources. Probably easy to get it from your family, but it could be really different. So I think I would just recommend modifying that.
That's true. I think, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I didn't want to jump. I eventually want to ask the question, but how are we managing the virtual queue? Is somebody keeping an eye on it?
We are now, Jamie.
There's a couple of us waiting.
Please feel free.
Oh, okay, thanks, Scott. Ariana, I'm really excited about this project and about, us working together on the Cultural Commons working group. So I just want to put that out there for everyone. Stay tuned. Coming to you this semester. And you also mentioned these really fascinating questions about authorship in your talk. Like who gets credit for what? And I've just been, the Ostroms were fans of Hayek's work on the knowledge problem in particular. And so I've actually just been engaging with that myself in this project I just finished. And he deals with this, he says knowledge enables that we get to benefit from knowledge that other people have through civilization. And that makes us all richer as a result. But part of that question is Hayek takes a very emergent approach to knowledge, right? So, let's say an artifact like a recipe, you might know who recently wrote that down, but you might not know who created a version of it 50 years before. And so that becomes a really interesting question of like, what is emergent and what, that you just have to accept as tradition, and what is a part that's authored that could be claimed by someone. We have to remember too that the idea of profit of copyright was, as you probably know from taking this class, copyright really IP only has been significant, especially since the 19th century. And so I think that shapes a lot of our creative industries in some really fascinating ways. I'll just leave it like that.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you. I think we can probably stop sharing so we can see everybody in Zoom land.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, maybe then we can take a question from Angie, Scott, and then Eric.
So I guess my question is also a comment, and Jamie, I'm glad you're here. I was hoping you were gonna chime in, so I'd like to encourage you to take on board what Dan said. That copyright is very American and very new. And a lot of the songs that you're even speaking of were frankly stolen. And cultural misappropriation and fill in the blank is a massive issue. And to me, recipes may suffer at the same hands of this. So I'd just like to challenge you to think a little bit outside of maybe what property might be doing to continue that legacy. And to think if whether or not that is going to give you the framework that you actually want. Right? Because copyright, you know, as Dan was mentioning, is, you know, if 5 of us sit down and perform a song as a 5, we each have copyright, but only in that moment of that song, not the original. So there's a lot more complexity to this that I'm imagining, you know, happens even in recipes. And I'd like to suggest to you that the first person that rubs to a publisher and gets something published, maybe we need to ask some more questions about. So just throwing that out there is something that gives some breadth and some depth to this. But I'm someone who buys cookbooks from India and fill in the blank. And it's lovely, and thank goodness that I have them, because my recipes would suck without it. But it doesn't mean that the person who actually published the book really has any claim to the culture that is created the recipe.
Yeah, I think appropriation is something that's really talked a lot about in like food media. And so that's something that's really top of mind to a lot of creators. And I thought about it when I was choosing the.
Here, the little twists of I'm gonna do, this is where I'm at. Let yourself go deeper. Let yourself go much deeper. You will enjoy the experience. You could end up in a place that very few people are both brave enough and knowledgeable enough to go to.
Yeah.
Good luck following that.
No, I love it. That was, yeah, that
Good
was
luck
deep.
following that.
This is a different.
You're so pumped up.
I appreciate that comment. I think that's very well taken. Wonderful job first. That was great. That was excellent. And you know, way back in the day before I turned to the dark side, I went to law school. I was going to do a cognitive science PhD. Like that was my thing. All right. And I know
Too late.
I'm only if it's never too late. That's right. And I'm vaguely remembering this, Ariana. So take it with a grain of salt, okay? But cognitive load theory, maybe you came across at some point. But this is the idea of we get overwhelmed by just too many choices. Like when we go online and search for recipes, right? There's just so much there. It's kind of the equivalent of seeing so many types of cereal on the shelf, right? So there's a whole field in that cognitive load theory is a part of. It's also a subset of marketing of how you help decision makers, i.e. consumers, navigate that morass. And I feel like that's what cookbooks to an extent are doing here. So I'm wondering, I don't know how much has been written about cognitive load theory cookbooks, but if you're looking for another hook around decision sciences and cognitive science, that could be an interesting area to explore anyway.
Yeah, thank you. I think that ties into the sort of like celebrity culture that's really driving the cookbook industry in the US right now, that like you don't have to decide for yourself because you can trust this public figure whose taste you know you can align yourself to.
By her pants.
I want the Snoop Dogg cookbook now. I'm curious.
If you want to ask your question.
Yeah, Eric, do you want us to read that off or did you want to elaborate at all?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I can, just asking about the scope of how this applies. So do these, you said that the recipes can't be copyrighted, but can like a procedure for like fixing a leaky faucet in like a fix-it book be copyrighted, or like a nature field guide where it's just like common knowledge about, you know, describing a chickadee or something, you know, where is it unique to recipe books or does it apply more generally?
It applies more generally. I definitely don't know enough to be able to answer the specific examples you give in your question. But I think my impression is that there's also a lot of discretion of the people working in, sorry, so I'm going to just talk about what I have experience with rather than hypothesize. So in the law class that I'm in, everyone, we talk through the cases and we don't always agree. And it seems to be that there's a lot of non-specialists deciding what is creative. So like we just talked about a rug design dispute, and there were these two rugs that were like too similar, and like all the people, there weren't rug experts in the courts making these decisions. None of us in the class are rug experts, but that's the group of people making the decisions about intellectual property, even though none of us have ever designed a rug. And so from my perspective as an outsider and kind of a skeptic, I think that there's a lot of assumed knowledge that goes into like, well, it doesn't look like it'd be that hard to come up with that. Rather than on the inside, it actually takes a lot of creativity to come up with a recipe or to describe how to fix a leaky faucet. I think it's a real art. I could never do that, or I could probably learn how to do it, but it would take a lot of work and creativity. So, and as Dan said, it's not a totally internally coherent body of law. So I'm
Great.
sorry, I don't know the specific examples.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering like where the scope was. So thanks a lot.
So there's this book collection from the 60s and 70s, I think might be interesting to shed light as well. I just think about the Foxfire collection, which is an anthology of oral histories that was collected by a private school in northern Georgia, but with people in central Appalachia. And I checked, it's copyrighted. There's about 10 or 12 books. And there's recipes, there's stories on hog dressing, planting by the sign, snake handling, burial customs, but it's all supposedly it's copyrighted. And so that would be interesting why those recipes can be copyrighted in the Foxfire collection and maybe other recipes can't. It just makes me think, and it goes back, it's like folklore and oral tradition that was collected by students and then they were published in this 12 book series, and now there's a magazine or something. It's still alive today, so you could actually contact a company, but how they are able to copyright those recipes, but not others, I don't know.
Yeah. So again, I'm not an expert, but like the cookbook itself, there'll be a copyright for the cookbook. So it's just that the list of ingredients and instructions itself, if someone else copied it, you couldn't sue for infringement for that particular use. But if someone copied your photograph or the head note, you could sue for infringement. And so or you could charge for infringement. So the part of the text, that's also where I'm thinking about that, like the recipe itself, which on its own is not protected, is protected by being in this larger web of protectable knowledge.
There's an interpretation of the recipe, like, you cut lard by this much to then, put in your string beans and whatnot. So is that like that sort of narrative protected, or is that?
I think a really literary description of how to do something that was like really focused on a poetic expression would probably be protected because it's like a display of creativity. So I think the kind of recipe or the part of the recipe that isn't protected is like add all the dry ingredients to the bowl, mix well. So again, that's the kind of recipe that we're all really familiar with. And so it doesn't sound creative to us. I defer.
Thank you.
I think it's really important to recognize recipes are not unprotected by intellectual property. They are by trade secrets law. Trade secrets start as not as intellectual property, but as property, as common law protection. And it's codified into trade secret law statutes that Congress enacts. But, if you want to protect a recipe, you keep it secret. And then if somebody takes your recipe, then they're guilty of theft. Or maybe somebody independently comes up, Coca-Cola never sought intellectual property for the formula of Coke, neither did KFC for special seasonings. They're closely held trade secrets. And so they're still very heavily protected as such.
Interesting notion of like, why are certain recipes, I know why it's funny, but like Why are certain recipes allowed to be secret? It's fine when Coke won't tell you the recipe, but when your grandma won't tell you how she makes her cookies, it's offensive.
Because it's your grandma.
Yeah, I mean,
It's culturally offensive or maybe it's not against the law.
But
But
I-
I want to treat it as.
And I-
If you want.
So,
grandma's like, it's my secret.
so the,
Maybe she's selling it a bit.
So coming back to my original comment, and I think articulating with Dan's point, it's like the ability to keep something secret is always there. So essentially, the contrafactual in terms of policy that we are considering is like, are you adding on top of that some kind of ability to file for a patent or a copyright that will give you a legal monopoly over the use of these ideas for a limited amount of time? Okay. So that's the key point. So the ability of trying to lock it down and then do all your private things to keep it secrets, those things are always there, no? So what we are observing in this sector is very interesting, because without any extra legal things beyond your ability to keep it secret, you get a lot of innovation, and that's the final thing that we all care about. Okay, and then why you are getting that? I think in part because there is these extra legal layers. And the reason is like some innovations also are inputs for new innovations. So when you add these extra intellectual monopoly things, you are increasing the cost of future innovations. And then the second thing is like many innovations happen while you are doing things. So if while you are doing something, like you are a chef, whatever, in a restaurant, you need to worry about copyright infringement, for example, then you will tend to innovate less. So I think part of the success of this sector has to do with avoiding, so not being able to come up with copyrights for the recipes. And then the other beauty thing connected to your point is like, yes, and you get innovation even if it's costly to innovate, even without this right to block others. How you get it? Well, it seems like people, for getting some extra likes on their blog, getting the reputation to then maybe write a book that summarizes recipes, for that rent, they're willing to spread the innovation. And that's why you are getting a lot of innovation in this sector. And again, it's so low the cost of innovating that with that little rent, it's enough to get a lot of innovation. And that's all you want to pay as a society. You don't want to overpay for your innovations with a monopoly forever, or an extra monopoly rents forever, when the entrepreneurs are willing to do it for a much lower price.
I guess I am curious about the assumption that like innovation is the goal, or that like innovation is a good, because I think like especially in food, there's lots of times when you don't want anything new, you want something that's like familiar. And I think like from the perspective of like the guiding principles of IP, I definitely think that like innovation is nominally the goal of what that should do. But I am struggling to think of like all the people on the ground being motivated by that goal of innovation, that I think like the individual people have a much broader array of interests or goals. And I don't know that like innovation is their goal. So I'm curious, how is it that all these people then do end up producing that innovation if it isn't their like individual goal? I'm curious.
Make a change while they are doing it. They are doing, so those are how historical has most innovations happen. You are in some industry, you do something, and then you find little different new ways of doing it.
Yeah, I wanted to touch upon what Gustavo was saying. Probably one dimension that we have been ignoring so far is that cooking requires a lot of talent as well, right? It's not only the recipe. So I don't think that innovation is not that critical here, but it is actually critical is how much talent you can put on top of everything. Because I mean, if someone gives me the best cooking book to me, I am not going to do a very good job, right? So yeah, I think that innovation is not that important, and probably we should not be focusing on that so much.
rather than on other aspects, as you were mentioning, and how personal this process can be and how much of your culture you can put into the process.
Mhm.
Like that, yeah.
Yeah, I think you point to something I'm really curious about, and I don't know how to study is the relationship between a recipe and what you cook from it. Like, what is it? Like, what is if the input is the recipe and the output is the food, like how strong is the influence of the recipe on what the food turns out to be? So who has any like methodological advice? Oh, wow.
Boom.
Quality of the chef.
Why are you, I mean, that's not a valid research question that several people have, but why are you asking? Right? Because when I hear people talking about innovation and economics and fill in the blank, when you're talking about recipes, I think my grandma's rolling over in her grave. I think an entire Black culture is rolling over in their, this is, so the question is for me, and I think I hear it coming through for you, is the conflict between individuals who are coming in and fishing in the lake, and we all agreed we're all going to share the lake. It sounds pretty familiar, right? What happens when someone comes in and says, hey, we were all going to boat and enjoy this lake, and turns out I'm going to make a recipe book? What the holy goodness? You're sort of at Ostrom 101 is my understanding of it. And I think I hear it creeping into you, and that's where I would start. So don't ask that question yet. Solve the first question. Is it actually a conflict between culture in terms of food as a gathering place and an expression of who we are as a family and a culture that has talent? It's why I'm not the cook. My husband's the cook in the family. It's right. So, or is it econ? Grandma would have loved $50,000, right? And this is, and that's right. And once you have that, I think then you'll be able, because here's what's going to happen. You're going to get excited. You're going to have 400 questions, which are great. But the reality is you've got to travel a path, or else you end up just with this scattershot of mess. So don't ask that, write that question out and keep it, but you're not there yet. You're still back with somebody's fishing in the pond that we thought we were all just sharing curry recipes about.
So can I ask a follow-up question? So it sounds like
You're gonna have to answer this. That's all I know about the fish in the pond.
I'm not asking about fish, that's okay. Shannon's ready. So something that I've heard from a lot of people when I tell them I'm doing my research is that there's a significant number of people who think that there should be no one who ever makes profit from a recipe. Is that what you think?
That's Jamie's musician stuff. That's how Jamie and I met. Was conversations with the Grateful Dead. It's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the Grateful Dead says, screw you all. This is our music to share with the world. Have fun with it. That's how JB and I met. Jamie talking about the Grateful Dead and I attended it. Wow, great. I'm like, Grateful Dead, I'm going. Stop fishing lips. I'm going to Grateful Dead. That's how
You're too kind. It's actually more Bob Dylan.
Say that again.
It was Bob Dylan, but that's okay.
Oh, Bob Dylan.
Bob was classic.
And they're all not with us. But anyway, it's that same type of conversation. And I think that's why you're having trouble thinking what the next step is, because you haven't really grappled personally with the issue that's the first step, which is this conflict between, is this artistic expression for the global community that is for everyone to share and participate in and build this culture around? Or should someone be able to put econ on top of it, and exploit it?
Wait a second.
He's gonna hate it. So there we go.
It's to be anarchy.
Embrace the stuck. It's a great place to be, especially in this place. Right?
Yeah.
Rob is gonna disagree.
Recipes and like a common like fishing, they are very different things, because if I cut one fish, you cannot catch the same fish. You can be using the recipe at the same time I can be using the recipe without any interference. So they are very different animals from my perspective. So essentially, and that makes it like, so it's like, why you want to restrict my use of a recipe while you are using it if I am not affecting you? The only traditional reason is like, because that generates more recipes. That's the reason that we have copyrights and intellectual property rights. And then what you are observing is like, you have a lot of new recipes, and you also get to keep the traditional recipes without that monopoly. And that's the beauty of your example. So essentially,
Thank you. That's really interesting. I really appreciate this debate.
This is a follow-up. Let's take one from Jamie and then follow up. Okay, Shannon. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, what's the order?
Shannon will make a follow-up and then it's your turn.
Shannon,
then
I got a follow-up.
Yep.
People post photos of the recipes they make on the comments under a lot of blogs, as well as things that they added or changed. Maybe something to think about when looking at how people actually interpret those recipes.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
That's all I got.
Yeah, that's just the program.
We have to have people that are specialists on draping.
Amy?
Yes, thank you. See, I think your project is so interesting because there's less protectionism right now, I think, in recipe making than what's happened to music. Because now we're at the point where people, will sue over actual basic patterns in music. And I also think more people cook and make recipes either on their own or from cookbooks or using, a recipe as a guide for their own creativity. Far fewer of us really do music or understand. It used to be much more common that somebody would play a musical instrument in culture now. Like in churches where I play, you'd be lucky to find one person that can play well enough to carry a service. So just our knowledge of music and culture is so different. And that means, I think, in the red case that you mentioned, it becomes a challenge then. Like, what kind of level of expertise are we bringing to the table when we make these questions about what IP is, or what should be IP and what shouldn't be? But what I love about your recipe example is so much of that is that there's this really interesting interplay between both, between the commons and between the private property. So, and I mean, there's so many, this is a long conversation to be had. I'm looking forward to continuing it. But I did want to make one point too about Gustavo brought, which is a really good point about exclusionism, because IP does give you that right to use a thing, but so I have several Ree Drummond's cookbooks, and whenever she mentions the big city in her work, she's talking about Tulsa, which is where I'm from and where I am now. So, but I can't, even though we share Tulsa as this thing in common, I can't take her recipes and go open another mercantile, in my town that's an hour away from her. She would be like, "What up, Jamie? You're not supposed to be doing that." So, but yet I can cook her recipes in my home, or I can even cook them to share at a party. So I guess there's also questions about what's being excluded and what's being included too.
Thank you, Jamie.
Just a short comments from my experiences during IP litigation. IP rights, you can sometimes play with it. So even if you cannot have copyright, you might use another. For example, fashion design, you might have a problem, but then you can go for the pattern, and then in the pattern, sometimes you would add a tiny mistake that wouldn't affect the results, but if the other one will use it with the mistake, you can prove that he copied the pattern. So there are different types of copyrights, and if you want to block the free, I mean, I know you said open, but if you want to block others, you might try. I don't have now on the top of my head any other idea to block, but you might try any of the other IP rights.
Yeah. Thank you.
Look, we used the whole time.
final reflections or thoughts?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this engagement and all this feedback. I'm really looking forward to continuing this research and continuing to share with the Ostrom workshop where this develops. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.